Today is the 10th of February, 2016, and we're discussing the results of the Iowa caucus on the 1st of February, 2016, and also the volatile primary in New Hampshire, and the votes are just being counted today, although officially it was over yesterday on the 9th of February. But I think we have some almost final results, not quite official, on the New Hampshire race. Anyway, my guest is Dave DeWitt, Athens News, who's the chief correspondent and a trained journalist. And my name is Robert Whaley, retired historian from Ohio University. And I'm looking back to many presidential races because I was born in 1932. No, I was born in 1930, but when I was 2 years old, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president. I don't remember Herbert Hoover personally. I saw him on film one time. He retired in World War II. He was still alive. He outlived Roosevelt in terms of his health. And of course, I heard Roosevelt speak when I was 14 in 1944. Well, anyway, I cast my first vote for John F. Kennedy when I was 30 years old. And this is called the Athens Speakout, number 354. And Donald Trump is an independent New York City real estate dealer, a millionaire who began running way back in July of 2015. And he is self-financed, and he has won so far in the Republican race. And most presidential candidates have to get money from lobbies and corporations, and then they become dependent on those lobbyists and corporations to pass special interests. So in 1948, I graduated from high school in suburban Long Island, and President Truman was the 33rd president. He was the vice president under Roosevelt. And he ran an interesting race against the governor of New York, Governor Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey was a liberal Republican, and Truman was a conservative Democrat from the middle of the country, from Missouri. And very few people really knew who Harry Truman was. Governor Dewey raised money from the National Association of Manufacturers, General Motors, Ford, Standard Oil, all of the big corporations assumed that Dewey had this election in the bag and Truman would certainly lose. So there was no primary in that year because Truman was the incumbent, so no Democrat was going to run against Truman, weak as he is. Well, they ran against him for delegates for the Democratic Convention, but they didn't go through any primary system. So Truman then raised his money from the big city machines of the Democratic Party. Boston had an Irish machine. Truman himself was a patronage Democrat who worked for the Kansas City machine, Tom Pendergast, in the 1930s, and Frank Hague was the boss of Jersey City. And of course, Truman also had the loyalty of the labor unions, the AFL-CIO and the UAW, and organized labor was really organized and much, much stronger in 1948 because Roosevelt won the union vote big in the New Deal era, and the corporations were on the defensive ever since the crash of 1929. So the big city bosses had a patronage system in which they hired cops and the fire department and the health inspectors, and then they asked these immigrants, mostly from Ireland, well, give us $5, $10 for the committee, and then we'll take that money and send a qualified man to be governor or senator to Washington to be much more honest than the big city bosses. So that was the corrupt system which began under Thomas Jefferson, when Thomas Jefferson developed the first machine in New York City. And Thomas Jefferson was a rural Democratic theorist from Virginia, but he needed the New York vote to offset the powerful Federalist Conservative Party of Alexander Hamilton, who led the Federalists. So corruption was inherent in the original democratic system. Of course,
Yeah.
the British House of Commons was patronage. If you wanted the House of Commons, they had rotten boroughs. You just went to some knight, he would give you the district, and these rotten boroughs in 1832, they had boroughs that were inherited from medieval times. They had no population, but still sent a member to the House of Commons.
Yeah.
Well, the first Reform Bill of 1832, which established the Liberal Party in England, got rid of rotten boroughs, and they gave the vote to the middle class who own property, white middle class, who own property, and there are only whites in England, who own property, and the women still didn't have the right to vote. So England is evolving slowly toward a democratic system. And the United States, under Jeffersonian democracy and then Jacksonian democracy, and Abraham Lincoln's liberal Republican, and then finally Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, was moving in a democratic direction, although there was still a corrupt element in the patronage system. Anyway, they didn't need a primary, and the Republican Teddy Roosevelt, who came from New York, came from Dutch ancestry, and Franklin Roosevelt was related to Teddy. Only Teddy was a liberal Republican, a trust buster, and also an imperialist, and they were the founders of the old New Amsterdam Dutch colony and had the best land from Manhattan to Albany. And then gradually immigrants from other parts of the world came and kind of overwhelmed the original Dutch establishment. But Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt all came from Dutch gentry.
In many ways, Teddy was responsible for really creating the first primary when he went back to challenge William Howard Taft as handpicked successor in 1912.
He started the Bull Moose
and
Party.
he started the Bull Moose
But
Party.
the primary was developed in New Hampshire.
And he wanted to have the people have their say, was his big line. Let the people have their say. Let's not have the party bosses pick the candidates. And
right, but
he began with that.
Well, part of the progressive movement was to establish a primary system.
Right.
In New Hampshire, in Wisconsin, Minnesota, they became some of the first primary states. And New Hampshire was the first in the country. 1912 election.
1912, right.
Yeah.
As I recall, even Teddy had to testify on the stand to he talked about the bosses of both parties, and they sued him saying, no, there's not bosses in both parties. And he had to testify, and he brought Franklin in actually to say, well, yes, I've seen party bosses on both Republican and Democratic
Teddy
side.
Roosevelt was vice president, and he had his first term before the 1912 election.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
he was president for 2 terms.
He did. He
1901.
finished McKinley's term.
That's right.
After McKinley was
Right.
assassinated, and then he had his own term, and then he made probably the biggest mistake of his political career, promising not to run for another term
Well, he
after his
he
first
thought
term,
Taft would be
and so he
loyal.
picked Taft as his successor.
But Taft was
and
a
then he was
conservative.
very unsatisfied with Taft, and
Yeah, Taft came from Cincinnati, and he had money. The Taft dynasty is very powerful.
starting with Alfonso, and then
Well,
William
that's
Howard.
the son of William Howard.
And I'm talking about the original Alfonso,
The original was William Howard.
right? And then that
Alfon-
led to Robert, Mr. Republican.
Robert Alfonso Taft. He was challenging Dewey in 1948
Right.
for the conservative wing of the Republican Party. In any case, Teddy Roosevelt was president from 1901 to 1908 and was a trust buster, and in 1911 pushed the Supreme Court case against the Standard Oil. On the other hand, he was an imperialist in Cuba and in Latin America and Philippines. So he has a kind of a mixed reputation of a bit of a leftist and bit of a right-wing type. Anyway, Truman, on the other hand, was a poor man who worked for the Prendergast machine. In 1920, he had inherited a farm and lost his money in the agricultural recession. Even before 1929, the agriculture was in bad shape throughout the Midwest. And then he went to work for a haberdashery inside Kansas City, and that business didn't turn out. So he went to work for Prendergast as a patronage collector. That is, you go around to the various counties in Missouri and ask the boss of each little city, how about a contribution for the party? And then in 1934, when the New Deal was gaining ground, Prendergast appointed a safe senator, Truman, and Truman in office simply voted straight party line for the New Deal legislation and brought subsidies back to the farmers of Missouri. And Missouri was a safe Democratic state in those days. Well, 1946 was a new era. Roosevelt died in office in 1944, only president who stayed for 4 years. And he made a lot of enemies, particularly among Southern senators. And his last election in 1944, he was a dying man. And the conservative Democrats said to Roosevelt, look, we're going to win the war. Very easy campaign. Don't change horses in the middle of the stream. And we're not going to put up any candidate against you. One condition. You get rid of that near-communist socialist Henry Agard Wallace.
Oh, yes.
Get rid of him as vice president.
Primary, right.
So if he should die, then the conservative South will get a friendly candidate. And that's exactly what happened.
Right, and Roosevelt did not attend that convention, and he kind of took a hands-off approach.
That's right.
And let it work itself out.
Right.
And it worked out so that Truman was a dark horse. I mean,
horse.
He came out of nowhere, really, but they just hated Wallace so much.
Well, they didn't know that Roosevelt would die. And he died in April 12th, 1945, before the war was over. And Truman got his reputation by carrying out Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson, and old Teddy Roosevelt hand. Now, Stimson was a Republican who was the Secretary of State for Herbert Hoover in 1931 and was very anti-Japanese. And then when Roosevelt was president and Hitler had conquered France, he needed a bipartisan foreign policy in order to get elected on the third term in 1940. So he put Frank Knox, a liberal journalist from Chicago, Secretary of the Navy, and Henry L. Stimson was made the Secretary of War.
Those were his two Republican
They ran the war.
gestures.
Efficiency. Well, they knew how to run the Navy Department of the Army. They got into the military.
Which Franklin obviously had experience with as Assistant Secretary of the Navy himself under
He knew who to
Wilson.
appoint. He knew who to appoint.
He was also very political in that
Right.
way.
Yeah, he knew the politics of diplomacy, but he didn't know the nitty-gritty of corporate power. And, of course, the Ford Motor Company, General Motors, Republic Steel in Cleveland, all of the industrial heartland made big profits, war profits, during the Second World War.
Of course.
So the Pentagon is really got its birth from Roosevelt in a way, but this was all unconscious because Roosevelt campaigned against Japanese imperialism, German imperialism, and fascist imperialism under Italy. And he was going to be...
All meanwhile taking the steps that would eventually hand the British Empire over to the American.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Truman was faced in 1946 with a sweeping Republican victory in both houses of Congress, the 80th Congress. So nobody said that Truman had any chance in 1948 except Harry Truman himself. Everybody abandoned him. Mm-hmm. Wallace abandoned him, and then you had
all the major newspapers.
The Dixiecrats abandoned him.
Yeah,
because Hubert Humphrey was a very
Southern Democrats,
a very liberal mayor of Minneapolis, and he went down to the Democratic convention and said, "We have to seat black delegates, not over my dead body." Thurman, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina had a little.
That was the beginning of the break.
Second round of the Civil War. We're going to form the Dixiecrat Party. Well, they took 4 states. Yeah. But Truman had enough votes to carry it despite the Dixiecrats. Now, Wallace put up a so-called Progressive Party, but he didn't take a single state.
Right.
He got all of his votes from New York, right. From socialists, but they didn't have enough to carry the whole state. So Truman won a scratch election with only about 10,000 votes between him and on the popular vote.
Right.
But he did well on the electoral vote.
The Electoral College,
yeah. with the ring. But anyway, this is an interesting election. Now, Cincinnati is a peculiar machine because it's a Republican machine. You know why that's Republican compared to most of the Democratic cities?
Well,
how did that happen?
You can go back through history all the way to the formation of the Republican Party. I mean, Alphonso Taft, who I mentioned earlier, was the Secretary of War under Ulysses S. Grant.
What happened in the
Ulysses S. Grant and
what happened in the Wilson
Sherman, all of them. You're talking Woodrow Wilson?
Woodrow Wilson alienated the Democratic Party and the Cincinnati city. Cincinnati is mostly a German city. Mm-hmm. And
and ethnically, most immigrants were Democrat.
Wilson said, "We are going to be neutral in this 1914 war. Mm-hmm. We're not going to get involved, and we're going to even be neutral in spirit."
So World War I?
Yeah,
pushed them over to the Republican side.
1916, Wilson runs for re-election. Mm-hmm. And he does the same thing Lyndon Johnson did. No wider war.
Runs as a peace candidate.
No wider war. 1965. Mm-hmm. Well, he says, William Jennings Bryan, a left-wing populist from Nebraska, was his Secretary of State, and he warned the Democrats. He said, "Wilson, you're going to drag the country into the war, whether you like it or not. As long as you sell munitions and cotton to the British and French, you're going to be dragged into this war. You're lending them the money. Who's going to collect that war debt?" Well, the Germans answered with submarines.
Right.
Well, then Wilson is toying with anyway.
And eventually
he ran, and the campaign in 1916 is he kept us out of war.
Of course.
He kept us out of war. Well, Cincinnati was a German partisan, neutral citizen, neutral toward the war, and said, "Vote for Wilson." April 1917, Wilson betrayed the isolationists by declaring war. And there were 52 votes in the House of Representatives in places like North Dakota, South Dakota, California, in the Midwest and Far West and South against. Again. And Cincinnati was one of those Republican cities that never returned to the Democratic fold as most. They had a Republican machine there.
Right, yeah.
One of the exceptions to
They were isolationists.
Well, they became isolationists because of that, and they were definitely on the forefront of checking Franklin Roosevelt in 1940 when Roosevelt made a slight recovery. But anyway, we get into this real question here. Question number one. Why did the top 10 Republicans do? How did they do? Who are these Republicans that ran? Well, you went to it. The first Cleveland debate in August of 2015. They put up 10 Republican candidates in the first tier, and then they had another 5 or 6, 17 or something in the second tier. Mm-hmm. Well, who were in that first tier? Can you name the 10?
All 10? In the first tier in that debate, it was Trump had just come on the scene, and he was leading the polls almost immediately, starting in July.
Right.
And he was overtaking Jeb Bush, who was number 2 at that time.
Right.
Now, after that debate, Ben Carson had a little bit of time in the sun, but it was mostly Trump and Jeb Bush.
All right, well, in order
jostling at that time.
In order of the polls in August of.
The other 10, you had Marco Rubio, you had Ted Cruz. Rand Paul was actually doing better back then.
Well, put them in order. Trump number 1 in the polls. Mm-hmm. Jeb Bush number 2. Then, because these polls.
Rubio, I believe.
Yeah. No, Jeb was number 2.
No, Jeb was number 2. I mean 3.
And 3 was Rubio.
Rubio, right.
Okay, so we had New York and 2 Florida candidates, 2 and 3.
Right.
And then we had Texas,
Ted Cruz.
Number 4. And then Rand Paul was an outsider from Kentucky, had some libertarian ideas.
Yeah, he's he was hanging on his dad's libertarian.
Yeah, and then we had
coattails.
Then we had a professional minister,
Mike Huckabee,
from Arkansas, who stole Hillary's old seat and Bill's old seat.
As governor?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because Arkansas was kind of corrupt in both parties. And then we had Scott Walker,
the Wisconsin governor.
He was 8. And then 9 was John Kasich, governor of Ohio.
Yes.
Now he's come up from 9.
He invested heavily in New Hampshire, which is why he did well there. He had over 70 town halls.
Right.
But he only got 16% compared to Trump's 34%.
Right. Well, back in August, we had Chris Christie, number 10, and he's finished number 10 today.
Chris Christie dropped out today.
Yeah, he didn't do well. Chris Christie was
this is why he dropped out.
Touched with corruption from New Jersey.
He's got a bridge to shut down.
Big city bosses. Philadelphia. A bridge scandal.
Yeah.
Patronage. Old-fashioned politics. Okay, let's have a new question. How did the Supreme Court case, Citizens United, passed in 2010, affect these 2 races in Iowa and New Hampshire?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, they've impacted them insofar as they've opened the floodgates to all sorts of dark money and corporate cash being flooded into the campaigns from all unaccountable directions.
Right.
As far as their impact on these races specifically, it's kind of interesting because Jeb Bush would be the leading candidate of dark money and corporate influence, and he's not doing very well.
Why? Why is he not doing well?
Why? Because the establishment, for lack of a better term, has not coalesced around a single candidate, in my view. You have Trump and Cruz, who are
Trump is not established.
No, I'm saying these are the non-establishment candidates, right? You have Trump and Cruz, who are out there.
Right.
On the other side, you have the establishment trying to decide well, are we going to back Bush or are we going to back Rubio or Christie? Wait a minute, Kasich looks interesting. He's trying to run a positive campaign. So you have many more cabinet candidates jostling for the establishment,
Right.
a blessing, and then you have these two outsiders, Trump and Cruz.
Right.
I think Jeb Bush's problem is that there's just too many candidates, and they haven't coalesced around him.
Well, he might recover in South Carolina.
He might.
He came in fourth here.
Yeah, in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In this last primary.
Right. And that's what they're all fighting for. But he's fighting Rubio tooth and nail for that establishment blessing.
Well,
right
that
now.
remains to be seen.
And Kasich's trying to get in there with his big showing in New Hampshire, but I think he's pretty much dismissed.
Well, you're predicting the future. I'm just going to get up to New Hampshire, and that'll be enough for me. Anyway, we can discuss it when we get to South Carolina. But anyway, the Supreme Court is part of the plutocracy. They're saying you can give all the money you want to all of the candidates because they knocked out Teddy Roosevelt's law, the Tillman Act, 1907.
Right. Yeah.
Corporations were prohibited from paying. Well, okay, the corporations, the big money people, set up a pact. Okay, all of these 10 are running because they can get millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And they're all egotists, and they say, well, we'll win on our own personality.
The Supreme Court made the argument that money is speech somehow.
Baloney.
Speech is free, and therefore
Undermining
there's
of the
no
Democrat-
accountability for money. Oh, I agree, absolutely. It's actively destroying our democracy and
Right.
undermining the republic and everything
Right.
that this country is supposed to be about.
Right. Well, okay, let's look at why New York City and Ted Trump was denounced by the other 9, but still won. And
well-
all the pundits did not. He had all enemies. The pundits and the other 9 candidates all said Trump is the man to beat.
Mm-hmm.
And Trump did it. Well, what are the issues that he's campaigning on? Why is he an outsider?
Trump?
Yeah.
His issues are immigration,
That's part of it.
anti-China,
Anti-China. Now, what does he want to do about China?
Well, he claims that China's beating us, China's taking all our money, China's taking all our jobs.
How are they doing it, though? Why does China's
What does he claim?
Why is China industrially becoming number 1 and surpassing the United States? Why are we importing everything that's made? Hats, cars, parts for the Boeing aircraft, everything is being made in China. How is that possible?
Because they have no standards for the standard of living for their workers, cheap labor.
Well, they pay 30 cents. I think they pay 60 cents an hour. That's one problem.
Yeah.
But who invests the money in China?
Well, they have, a lot of people do. We invest some money. They
Not
hold
we. What? No, not we.
the American
No.
Treasury, they hold
Wait a minute.
$1.6
This is
trillion of our
Trump's
dollars.
issue. But Trump's saying, I'm a real estate man who has my own money in New York State.
Mm-hmm.
But Standard Oil, Boeing Aircraft, Ford Motor Company, they are part of the Wall Street international banking system.
So you're saying that Trump is saying this?
Trump
or you're
is
saying that Trump is right and this is true?
Trump has a good campaign issue.
Okay.
We're going to take care of China. How is he going to take care of China? Put a tariff on. How are you going to take care of the money that's parked overseas? Pass a tax. Trump and Sanders are really talking the same thing. Put a tax on the money in Cayman Islands, Switzerland. You bring that money back, or it'll be confiscated. Now, Sanders is an outright socialist, says we'll do it. Trump is just a closet circuit. See, he campaigns against. He doesn't say this. He says it's what does he call it? It's not propaganda. It's What's his slogan? I just have it down
Make
here.
America Great Again?
No. Well, that's what he said. His theme is "Make America Great," but his campaign is against the campaign pundits, the people who are saying we are what's the name of the thing? Correct, political correctness. That's the term.
Oh.
Political correctness is the same as propaganda. Who invents political correctness? Who says what's political correct?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, I'm
Who
asking.
says that?
Where did the term political correctness come from?
I don't know its etymology.
No, it came from the television industry.
Yeah, I
They
mean,
all
that's-
say the same thing.
It's where the standards are.
If you say anything against Wall Street, you're not going to be politically correct. If you say anything against Chase National Bank, Deutsche Bank, the banks, the insurance company, the people who brought on this 2006 recession are all talking about political correctness. Now, the most political incorrect person is Bernie Sanders.
By that standard, yeah.
And secondly is Trump. Trump,
But by a different standard. But that, I think that people call Trump politically incorrect more due to his xenophobia and sexism and racism.
Okay, they have some differences. Yeah. Certainly, Sanders is not a racist. And Trump has certain racial, well, he campaigns. He's against women.
He's dog whistling.
Yeah. He's a blowhard in that sense. So he's alienated women. He's alienated the Mexican vote. But he's campaigning against a real issue. Drugs are coming in. So he's going to be hard on drugs, and he's going to be hard on Chinese. But he's not particularly anti-Chinese. That's just the way the left interpret that.
Not as a
not as an ethnic group. Yeah,
not as a people, right? Not as an ethnic group.
He's against Chinese imports.
He's saying that China is winning the business agreements with America, and we need to do better and win those.
And the
instead.
Democratic establishment are just stupid by making all of these free trade agreements with China, and they're taking the Democratic establishment to the cleaners. The foreign trade. We have a foreign trade deficit with China. We have a debt.
Yeah.
Now Trump is hitting.
They hold some of our debt too.
Yeah.
They're trying to.
Right.
What the Democrats are trying to do is counter the Chinese trade agreements with European countries with things such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is controversial on the left because people see that as another NAFTA.
So all of my
undermining the American worker.
All of my Democratic friends, Trump is the worst. Now my idea was
Trump's policies are not the worst. He might be one of the worst human beings, but I actually consider Ted Cruz, both policy and personality, to be far worse than Trump.
Maybe so. I'm not going to vote in the Republican primary in any
Neither
case.
am I.
All am I saying is that he's touching a real nerve when he says the first thing I'm going to do is build a fence around Mexico and Arizona and Texas and keep drug smuggling out. He's going to get a lot of votes on that.
Yeah,
drugs is a real problem.
I mean, he will get votes.
And his second issue is raise the tariff against Chinese imports. He's going to get a lot of votes on that. And that's why.
But he doesn't put it like that. He doesn't say. I want to raise the tariff. He doesn't present a plan. He says, the Chinese, they're beating us at everything. They're taking our money all the time. My people are going to do better. We're going to do great. We're going to have the good deals. He doesn't put it as eloquently as you just said. He doesn't present a plan for tariff raising.
You and I are part of the elite, okay. But Trump is talking to the white, unemployed working class, and he's talking tough. He just says, China.
Well, that's what they view it as. It's just, it's tough talk.
He's a right-wing populist. He's saying they're taking us to the cleaners.
Yeah.
So
which is nothing unusual in
history. The white
history.
males who are in trouble are voting for Trump. And you pick that up in the polls. You listen to how many people are saying,
Sure.
I was a Democrat, but I'm going to vote for Trump.
I would make the argument that you only get so far with that type of politics
This is
of
good in the
negativism.
beginning. This is good in the beginning. But as the campaign goes on, I think you're right. Trump will begin to fade.
I still believe the American people largely prefer a politics of optimism.
Optimism, yes.
And
But
telling everyone who to hate will only get you so far.
Yeah. Okay. Well, his third issue is he can sneer at women pundits, and he doesn't care about Hillary, and he doesn't care about the women's vote, and he doesn't care anything about MSNBC or Fox or CNN. He says, well, they're all political correct, and that brings me back to Orwell. Mm-hmm. The importance of Orwell. Art is propaganda.
We should probably take a station break.
Oh, thanks. That's a very good point. We're having a vigorous debate. We're both Democrats, and I'm looking at it from the point of view of historically, there is a corrupt element in both the Democrat and Republican parties, and the average voter only has a high school diploma. He's not a PhD. He's not an MA. He doesn't know what these pundits are really talking about. They're using vocabulary way above their head. So Trump then is talking to the white working class who've been bitten by political correctness. They don't bother to look at they don't know the New York Times. They don't read anything. Mm-hmm. So this is the importance of Orwell, because Orwell exposed propaganda. And he wrote these famous books.
Brutally. Most famous, 1984, and Animal Farm.
Animal Farm and 1984. Animal Farm is a historical allegory.
It was a criticism of the
right.
Stalinists.
It's based on real history.
Bolsheviks,
Yeah, he says that these two pigs are Trotsky and Stalin.
Yeah.
And Stalin took over Animal Farm, and Animal Farm is a nice euphemism for capitalism. And they set up Animal Farm, which is communism. And then,
Bolshevik, Stalinist communism.
Yeah, but anyway,
communism.
Big Brother Napoleon, the big pig, betrays the other animals, the chickens and the goats and so forth and so on. And they have dogs who are the KGB and go out there, and he becomes a dictator. And then he chases Snowball, who is
the horse.
Trotsky, out of the country, and eventually assassinates Trotsky.
Kills him.
Yeah. So
true.
this is based on the history. But it's not an anti-communist tract.
No, it's an anti-Stalinist.
Anti-Stalinist. That's how it's misinterpreted in the United States.
Right.
Because the average American thinks, oh, well, he's an anti-socialist. He's an anti-communist.
No, he's anti-Stalinist.
Yeah, and he is a democratic socialist.
Yes, he was. Very much so. Yeah.
Well, anyway, George Orwell, who's never mentioned in the campaign, neither Democrats or Republicans want to touch on him. This is a political science satire.
Yeah.
And he takes television and he says, this gadget is going to be the instrument which Big Brother or a dictator can control the minds.
Newspeak.
Newspeak. That's political correctness.
Yeah.
Newspeak, political correctness and propaganda have a certain connection.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. No, I see where you're going with it. I think it's a great point. I think Orwell is more relevant now than ever.
That's right. He's going to be revived. Now, maybe Bernie Sanders has read this.
I bet he has.
If he does, he might do better than we thought. Anyway, this is his third book, which is not a book. It's a collection of his essays.
His essays, yeah.
Written by
and it's important to note, actually, while he's famous for the two novels, Orwell was a brilliant journalist, a brilliant essayist.
Right. And this is where he gets his moral backing the sources for these other books. Now, he's just dismissed as an atheist, but he's a little more subtle than an atheist. He has an essay on Charles Dickens. He has an essay on Shakespeare. He has an essay on Hitler. He has an essay on Stalin, and so forth and so on. Mm-hmm. So he's very critical of novelists and journalists in England, and the United States are even more primitive than the English writers.
Yeah.
He doesn't touch any American. He leaves them alone.
Yeah.
But his hate week is taken from Madison Avenue. You know, Chicken Week,
Right.
Black Week. This was his idea. And Winston Smith is a little middle-class journalist whose duty is to read the London Times every day and put it down the memory hole. Computers. He anticipates computers. And then Big Brother says everybody's forgotten what the party line was yesterday. We have a new party line. Who's the enemy? So there are three Big Brothers, one in a fictional country called Oceania. Mm-hmm. Now, Oceania is England, NATO, United States, and he just includes Latin America and Africa as just inconsequential satellites and have no choice. Part of the old British Empire. Mm-hmm. And it goes around to Taiwan and Japan, and that's in Oceania. So Oceania and London becomes landing field number one.
Right.
Very close to NATO. He anticipates NATO. And then
and
East Asia and Eurasia, that's the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China.
At the time he was writing, I mean...
And he anticipates the victory of Mao Zedong. The Republican Party are still tuned into the past, and Chiang Kai-shek, he died before the Korean War broke out, but he's right on target up to his death. I mean, from his death up to the year 1984. Now,
George Orwell? Yeah, and he died young. He was 39?
Well, I think he was 46, but the
Was it 46? Okay,
important thing is this year.
Yeah.
1984 is 1948.
And he wrote it in 48.
He wrote it in 48, but it was published in 49.
Right.
He died in January of 1950. He barely saw a review on this. He died of TB at age 46.
Right.
But in America, in 1984...
He was 39. Was it? Oscar Wilde was 39.
Yeah. In America, in the year 1984, we had all optimistic liberals. Schlesinger. He said, oh, well, we know it's in 1984. We have more civil rights than ever before, and liberalism is okay. Schlesinger's too optimistic about the victory of liberalism and democracy. Orwell has a certain point that...
No, he was skeptical.
That democracy
and I think that he understood that well, you could tell from Animal Farm, he understood the danger of Stalinism.
Right. And newspeak and television and...
Yeah.
Now, where he's a little bit weak, where his predictions go wrong, is he had no idea that the Soviet Union would collapse. So we no longer have three big powers.
Right.
And he didn't anticipate the Middle East at all. The Middle East is a kind of a no man's land.
Well, that would have been hard to anticipate, too.
Yeah, but I mean today, the Middle East is actually a no man's land. The Soviet Union Russia has a little influence. America has a little.
With Iran, yeah.
And China has a little influence. But it's just it's a no man's land of tribal terrorists. We're either going to have a short war against ISIS, which is inconclusive, or a long 30 years war.
Yeah, they don't. Their alliances are all interwoven amongst each other and very tenuously connected to the wider world.
Well, I guess
Oscar Wilde was. I just looked it up. Oscar Wilde was 46 too.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm kind of winding up on my comments on Orwell here. I'm just going to check my notes and see if I want to say anything else. I think I've covered the balance of power there. So Orwell got this idea of what Big Brother looked like. It was a composite of Adolf Hitler, his Nazi party, the Führer, and Benito Mussolini, the Duce, and Franco, chief of staff in the Caudillo. So he started out as a revolutionary socialist. But in 1941, June 1941, Orwell kind of turns conservative in a way because he discovers totalitarianism. And he says, well, Stalin is really a Soviet fascist. Chairman Mao is a kind of a fascist. This is where he gets the idea of totalitarianism and the Big Brother. And I don't think the American voter has really caught up to the subtlety of this thesis and work of Orwell. So Orwell was saying all parties, all religions use propaganda. The liberals are using it, the Roman Catholic Church,
Right.
the Communist Party, Hitler, the USSR, they're all using propaganda. But they don't call it propaganda. They call it political correctness. Or in World War I, the British had...
Or they point their finger at something else and call that political correctness.
In World War I, the United States, under Wilson, had the Creel Committee, the Office of Information. And in World War II, Roosevelt set up the OWI, the Office of War Information. We're only giving information.
Well, and here's a
and
great...
Eisenhower had psychological warfare. They didn't have any propaganda.
When did we change it from the War Department to the Defense Department?
That was
There's a nice little piece of propaganda.
That's right. That is absolutely right. It was done by James Forrestal.
Forrestal, okay.
He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, was a stockman, graduated from Princeton, and when Frank Knox died,
Oh, okay, yeah.
he inherits the Defense Department. And he was absolutely paranoid about communism in the Soviet Union. So he then starts the Cold War himself. He starts the Cold War as a slogan. Communism is the only enemy. Of course, he actually got the term Cold War from Walter Lippmann.
Oh, really? The journalist?
Walter, he invented the Cold War.
Okay.
It's a metaphor.
And it was very useful to build up the military-industrial complex.
That's right.
Post-World War II.
Right, yeah. Well, I guess that's all I want to say about propaganda and Orwell and its effect, its importance to my thinking about these elections. Okay, let's ask another question. What were the results of the Iowa caucus, 2nd of February, 2016?
Well, Ted Cruz won the Republican side. Trump and Rubio followed closely behind.
Yeah, it was a big surprise that Cruz came in first.
Was it? It wasn't to me because he had the ground game.
He had the ground game. Yeah, that's good.
He had a
You studied it in detail. You're the journalist.
He had a great ground operation, which means that with the caucus you have to get. It's one thing to have people say yes on the telephone. It's another thing to get them out to caucus for you.
Right.
And Ted Cruz had the organization to get people out there to caucus for him. Rubio and Trump. I mean, they both still did well.
They came close.
But neither of them had the ground game that Cruz had, and I think that's why. That's what put him over the top.
Rubio came in third. And fourth was?
Who was fourth? Fourth was...
an outsider. John Kasich, wasn't it?
Kasich was fourth in Iowa?
Yeah, I think so.
I didn't know that. No.
Surprise.
Yeah, that is. And then what? Who? Rand
Then
Paul?
Rand Paul was fifth.
Okay. Yeah.
And Casey's made a strong showing. And Walker was his competition. He fell out.
Yeah, Walker fell out.
Yeah.
Walker had invested heavily in Iowa,
Right,
so
right.
he must have hoovered up those votes.
And Ron Paul and his libertarianism faded as a third party, so he just barely made it. So they were the top five. And
then on the Democratic
six
side.
was Jeb Bush. He's had the money, but he didn't have what Trump said. He doesn't have the energy.
Mm-hmm.
Trump has the energy. He can go out there and talk to the unemployed worker.
He
We're
doesn't
going to
have
take
any
care of the Chinese.
relatability.
He doesn't say how he's going to do it. We're going to take care of the Chinese. We're going to build that fence. If the Chinese can build it, I can build a fence. Don't tell me I can't build a fence.
Yeah.
He's got the old razzmatazz, as they say, in New York. And the interesting thing is, he's the only New Yorker who's ever run since Franklin Roosevelt. New York has been under a shadow ever since Thomas E. Dewey.
Yeah, that's true.
They
And
all
that's
have to be-
interesting because they used to be, New York governor would be,
Powerful,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
And for many years, just New York politics
well,
was
it was
a
the
very
Cold War and
controlling.
the Southern strategy of Nixon and the recovery
Yeah, that's
and
right.
racism that just left New York.
And there was a geography to
Yeah.
New York that always lent itself to
Yeah.
politicians from
No,
New
I
York
think
as
that
emerging.
Trump should not be underestimated. He hires Chinese and blacks and Mexicans in his hotel business.
Mm-hmm.
He's giving them jobs on the New York level.
Yeah.
He's just going to get rid of that Mexico City drug dealing. So he's not as dumb as he looks. Anyway, but so Jeb had the money, but he didn't have the energy, or didn't have the gall to challenge Trump. I think he's smart though, because he probably come up in South Carolina,
Jeb? Oh, yeah.
and Trump may. Well, I don't know how he's going to do in South Carolina. South Carolina's.
I don't expect him to do well. I expect him to do much better in Nevada. But again, that's caucus state.
Yeah. Well,
So
anyway.
he's going to have to get people out to caucus for him.
Yeah, but you see, there's a lot of bitterness about the George W. Bush administration and the 41st president and George W. Bush, the 43rd president, in losing a war, 2 wars in the Middle East with Iraq and Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody wants to talk about it. Hillary doesn't want to talk about it.
She voted for it. So no.
Sanders is talking about it in very low terms.
Well, yeah,
He's
but that's
very
not
tough.
his big issue is
Well,
wealth and income
he might
inequality.
have some problem, and
He'll have to get more into foreign policy.
If he does get into the Middle East, he's going to have problems because the Jews only have 2% of the population.
Yeah, but he's not a big Zionist.
No, he's not a Zionist at all. He's
Right.
actually repudiated Zionism.
Right.
But the voter doesn't understand that.
Yeah.
If you look at the website, Trump defines himself as a secular Jew.
Okay.
I believe in God. That's it. And he's very critical of Netanyahu and the whole
Yeah.
establishment.
Yeah.
It's the Fox, Charles Krauthammer.
The neocon. Oh, yeah.
He's the big enemy of.
Yeah. They're not going to like him at all.
He's just saying he's an outright communist,
Yeah.
and that
They're
goes
going to
up.
throw all sorts of nasty
that
stuff
goes
in
well
his way.
over in Fox Channel, but whether NBC, ABC, CBS will pick up some of that, who knows? So that might be a closer race than we think. Anyway.
And then Iowa, the Democratic side, they left it in a statistical dead heat. Hillary won by a very small margin
Right.
due to coin tosses.
Right. So anyway, in the Iowa caucus then, Cruz took 27% of the vote, 8 delegates. Trump was second with 24%. We only have a couple minutes. 23% for Rubio, 8 delegates, 2 delegates. Ron Paul was number 5 with 1 delegate, And I guess we'll have to wrap it up with those results, and we'll have to pick up the tail end of the Trump Bush race when we get to. We'll have a little review of this, and at the same time, we'll get into South Carolina and Nevada. So I have a few little extra tail end notes next time. Would you like to say anything here about?
Well, I just want to say that I think that you made a great point about the relating PC culture,
Right.
as it relates to the Trump campaign and the Sanders campaign, and especially Orwell, because I think that there is an enormous pushback against what people perceive as PC, and kind of a defiance of that.
Right.
And I think you're right that that's going to play a huge role in this year's election.
Right. This is the most flexible election, probably. Well, it was a little flexible in Ronald Reagan, but in a way, Reagan Reagan went off on a new tangent. He did eliminate.
He was mourning in America.
Well, that was just old stuff. That was old hat. But the important thing, I was deceived by Ronald Reagan. I thought he was an absolute fool when he ran Star Wars.
Oh, yeah.
But he signed the START agreement and actually ended the Soviet-American arms race.
Right. He wasn't a fool.
Well, there was some
He
moral.
might have had some moral
He had
issues.
some moral background.
Right.
His mother was a Christian Calvinist. He belonged to the church, one of those churches. But he was an optimistic Christian. He was not a pessimistic Cruz type.
Right.
He was a glad hand type. Billy Graham, we're all up. He was going to win. And he was very optimistic.
That's what it goes with what I was saying earlier. I think the American people prefer politics of optimism.
Yeah, Christianity is not yet dead, although it's in trouble. Anyway, thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Professor. Nice to be here.
Okay.